Most often, when somebody becomes a manager for the first time, they get no instruction as to what the job is, what it means, and they often get bad signals. I think one of the themes of Radical Candor is that telling people what to do doesn't work. But an awful lot of people think their job as boss is to tell people what to do. And so one of the goals in writing the book and also in starting the company and doing the podcast is to begin giving managers, brand new managers as well as more experienced people, the sort of step-by-step instructions of what's the philosophy and what are the things you can do to put a good management philosophy into place.
That is Kim Scott, the New York Times bestselling author of Radical Candor, Be a Kickass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. She's giving her take on why there are so many bad bosses, or at least the perception of so many bad bosses today. This conversation I had with Kim took place 5 years ago, well before the pandemic, but I wanted to reshare the conversation because I think it's something very relevant for us in a post-pandemic world. During our conversation, Kim shares a pivotal moment in her career where she felt she had failed an employee by not giving them honest feedback. From that point on, she promised herself she would never make that mistake again and that she would help others practice radical candor. That moment led to Kim's book, as well as the Radical Candor podcast, CEO coaching, and a software company she created to help people take the advice from the book and actively put it to use in everyday life. During our discussion, you will also learn about why there are so many bad bosses in the world, the big problem with passion, how to show you care, and the dimensions of radical candor. I also take some of your questions from LinkedIn and Twitter.
The thing that is most important about radical candor is that we want a witness to our lives. And there's nothing worse than feeling invisible. And so radical candor will give you a witness to your life, and it will help you grow in the way that you want to grow. What I mean by that is when you're doing great work, you want it to be recognized. And when you're screwing up, you want to know that somebody will tell you and help you fix it. Those are the things that are going to help you take a step in the direction of your dreams. And that's why Radical Candor helps create a better employee experience.
The world is changing quickly. What do you need to know and do in order to be successful now and in the future? From leadership to the future of work to employee experience, this show will give you the insights and the tools you need to succeed and thrive professionally and personally. Make sure to follow me on Spotify or subscribe to the show on your favorite platform. You can do so easily by going to futureofworkpodcast.com. Also, please rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred platform is. It really helps spread the word about the show, and I personally appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Future of Work podcast. My guest today is Kim Scott. She's the New York Times bestselling author of an awesome new book called Radical Candor, Be a Kickass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. She's also the co-host of the Radical Candor podcast and co-founder of Candor, Inc. Kim, thank you for joining me.
Awesome to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Jacob.
So what was the date that your book actually came out? Was it March 27th?
It was March 14th. It was Pi Day.
Oh,
very appropriate for a Silicon Valley book.
Very appropriate indeed. My new book on employee experience came out 2 weeks after yours.
Wow. Yeah. And I love your book. Awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. All right. So as I always like to do with guests on the show, is starting off with some background about you. So where or how did you get involved with this stuff? Where did you grow up? How are you now doing all the wonderful things that you're doing now?
So I grew up in Memphis. I was born and bred for manipulative insincerity, not for radical candor. And I struggled as a manager early on in my career. From the very first time I was a manager, wondering, I was very much brought up like an awful lot of people, believing if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. And now all of a sudden it was my job to say it. And I found this to be very difficult. And then I learned in a very painful way. I was doing a startup in New York City in 2000, and I had hired this guy who I really liked a lot. Let's call him Bob. And Bob was charming, he was smart, he was funny, he had an incredible resume. And he would do stuff like we were having one time one of those get-to-know-you games at a manager offsite. And everybody hates these games, feels like they're a waste of time, but nobody dares to say it. And Bob was willing to say it. He said, listen, we all seem frustrated by this, but I've got a different idea. It'll be really fast. Let's just go around the table and share with each other what candy our parents used when potty training us. Weird, but fast. Even weirder. Everybody remembered Hershey Kisses right here. So if I'm grouchy, you know what to get for me. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So anyway, we all loved Bob. He was quirky, he was weird, and we loved him. Only one problem with Bob. He was doing absolutely terrible work. And it was puzzling because he had this great background. In fact, I learned later the problem was that he was smoking pot in the bathroom, which maybe explained all that candy all the time.
Yes, I think that's a good explanation.
But I didn't know that at the time. And so instead of telling Bob when his work wasn't nearly good enough, I would say to him stuff like, Bob, this is a really good start. And he would hand something in to me with shame in his eyes. He actually knew it wasn't good enough. But instead of just calling it out, I would say, Bob, you're so smart. You're so awesome. This is a really good start, but maybe you could improve on it a little bit. And then, of course, he didn't. And this went on for 10 months. And eventually, the inevitable happened. And I realized that if I didn't fire Bob, I was going to lose half my team. And so I sat down to have a conversation that I should have started with Bob 10 months previously. And when I finished explaining to him where things stood, he sort of pushed the chair back from the table. He looked me right in the eye and he said, why didn't you tell me? And as that question is kind of going around in my head with no good answer, he says to me, why didn't anybody tell me? I thought you all cared about me. And now I realize that I have failed Bob in 6 really important ways. I have failed to ask him for criticism or praise. I've failed to solicit feedback from him. Maybe I was doing something that was driving him so crazy. He was forced to toke up in the bathroom, right? I'll never know because I didn't ask. Maybe I was doing some stuff he really did like, but I didn't ask. I didn't ask him how things were going from his perspective. So that's the first 2 failures. The next 2 failures were I failed to deliver either praise or criticism. Remember, feedback is praise and criticism. And I failed to deliver praise that was meaningful. The kind of praise that I gave was really just a head fake. And I failed to tell him when his work wasn't nearly good enough. I failed to deliver criticism that let him know that he really needed to make a change. So that's the next 2 failures. So now we're up to 4. And perhaps worst of all was I failed to create an environment in which everyone would tell Bob what was really good about the work he was doing and when he was going off the rails. And because of that, because I made these 6 mistakes, Bob's getting fired. And that's the worst thing about management. The most difficult thing about management is that you learn all your most important lessons on the back of somebody else.
How long ago was that?
This was in 2000. This was at a startup I did called Juice in 2000. So it was a long time ago now. A shockingly long time ago now. 17 years ago.
Yeah. So I guess the reason why you wrote the book, the reason why you have the podcast, Candor Inc., all these different types of things, I guess it stemmed from that kind of moment and evolved to where you are today.
Yes, that moment was when I promised myself in a very solemn way that I would never make that mistake again and that I would work really hard to help other people avoid making that mistake. And then fast forward, over the next 17 years, I kept managing larger and larger teams. And over and over again, I felt like I was watching a slow motion train wreck because everybody makes this mistake as a manager. And so I really have spent over the course of my career a lot of time trying to think through what I could do to help people avoid making that mistake. And that's not the only mistake I ever made. There were others as well.
Oh, yeah, mistakes are part of life.
Yes, they are. But that's sort of the core idea of Radical Candor, is figuring out how to avoid that mistake.
Well, it reminds me, one of the reasons why I went off on my own around 8-10 years ago and pursued this idea of the future of work and employee experience is because I had a bad situation at work where I did really well in school, graduated with honors, and I studied economics and psychology. And this first job out of college, which, I tell time and time again, so if people are familiar with the story, I'm sorry. But after college, I'm told that I'm going to do all these really wonderful things for this company. And a couple of months into my job, I'm doing data entry and cold calling and PowerPoint. Yeah. And then one day the CEO comes out and he hands me $10 and he's like, "I'm late for a meeting. Go get me a cup of coffee."
Oh, my God.
Yeah. And so after that, I was just mentally checked out of that company. And I had one other situation similar to that in the Bay Area. And after that, I was like, this sucks. Like, there's no reason for me to work for anybody else. So it's funny how we have those pivotal moments that force us down a different direction.
Yeah, that cup of coffee, that was a meaningful cup of coffee.
Oh, yeah.
As it turns out.
And it was at a Starbucks, too. So thank you, Starbucks.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And so how are you, for the past 17 years, you have a lot of interesting stories. I know you're a CEO coach. You worked at Google. You've been faculty at, I think it was Dropbox and Apple. So what is your day-to-day like now? Are you just advising CEOs and helping them become better leaders?
So right now, what I am spending most of my time doing is building software that coaching doesn't scale. So we're building software that will help people take the advice in Radical Candor, in the book I wrote. So we're working on a set of software that'll teach you how to give better feedback, and then help you find the moment to give feedback and track what kind of feedback you've given to whom on your team, and give you reminders. You haven't praised Charlie in 3 weeks. You better find something nice to say to Charlie. Or you failed to give criticism to Charlene over the last month. You better make sure that you're giving Charlene enough critical feedback as well as praise. Or probably most importantly, you haven't spent enough time soliciting criticism from the people who you work with. You better find out what they're thinking and how they're feeling about what's going on. So we're starting with feedback, but we're also going to help people have more effective one-on-ones, help people have more effective staff meetings, help people have better career conversations, that sort of thing.
So now you are a product and a software entrepreneur in addition to everything else that you're doing. Yes.
Started Candor Inc. With Russ Laraway, my co-founder, a little more than a year ago, and have been having a great time ever since, working with Shona Brown, who was a mentor of mine at Google to get this platform built.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
What does your life look like now? I mean, are you up at like 5 o'clock in the morning, working till 6 o'clock at night, then coming home? Are you traveling all the time? What is the behind the scenes of Kim's life look like?
It is pretty structured. So most important time of my day is 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. And that's the time that I spend with my kids. And then the weekends, I get some time with them on the weekends too. It's very funny. I was talking to a young engineer who was asking me what it's like to have kids. And I sort of was explaining this schedule to him because he just couldn't imagine how could you possibly have time to have children. And when I explained to him my schedule, he nodded and he said, yeah, it's kind of like baseball season having kids. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Baseball season.
But it's actually a really good analogy. He said, I always wondered he played baseball in college. And he said, I always wondered in college how I was going to get all my homework done during baseball season. And yet somehow it just worked out. I just blocked, there's practice in the morning, practice in the evening, and the rest of my time I still had time to do my work. So Albert Nye, one of the great software engineers in Silicon Valley, came up with the best analogy for parenting I've heard yet. So that's the core of the day. And then I'll take a quick walk with the dog, sometimes run, depending on how I'm feeling. Now that I'm pushing 50, I feel entitled to take a stroll for my exercise. And then I take a quick shower, and I hop in the car, and I'm at work for our stand-up at 9:30, stay at work till about 6 o'clock, about 5:45, and then go home and have dinner with the kids, and after they go to sleep, hop online for a couple of hours. I try very hard to sleep from 10:30 p.m. till 6:30 a.m. 8 hours of sleep is really important for me. Although, true confession, I've been struggling with insomnia since I started this company. But at least
I wonder why starting a company is causing the life of an entrepreneur.
Yeah, can't imagine.
Well, it's really interesting that you're involved with so many different things, and congratulations on the new company. It sounds like something that a lot of organizations around the world really need. Are you also still doing some advisory as well? Your CEO coaching?
Not doing very much of that. I spend some time. I'm on the board at Qualtrics, and I spend some time with the Qualtrics CEO and Ryan Smith, who you can read about in the book. But for the most part, I'm really focusing on scaling the coaching. One-on-one coaching doesn't scale, but the Candor Coach, the product that we're building, will scale. And it's very interesting because I find that brand new managers and CEOs of highly successful companies, they share a lot of the same struggles and problems. And so I found as I was coaching that one very common occurrence was I'd go in, we'd have a conversation about something, a performance issue with somebody on the team, or thinking through how to make sure that you know what's really happening deep in your organization, whatnot. And then I'd go back to my desk after the conversation and copy and paste the 2 or 3 pages in the book that I had written about just that topic, and I'd email it. And the response would always be, wow, how'd you write that so fast? And I said, you're not the first person to have this problem. I actually wrote this, months ago. And so figuring out how to get managers the right page in the book, the right paragraph in the book at the right moment, I think is going to be part of what helps people change their behavior. Because as great as the book is, I don't think people read a book and then change their behavior. As great as the talks that I do are, I think they are great. But people don't change their behavior because they heard a good talk or read a good book or listened to a great podcast. They change behavior through daily sort of tasks. And so we're trying to give people daily tasks. And then because we know what their daily tasks are, we can give them just the right piece of content that'll support that task at the right moment.
Very cool. I'm also curious, do you have any work routines that you're very committed to, like a certain practice that you do at work, or, only check email at 4 o'clock, for example, is something that I try very hard to do. But are there any workplace practices that you use in your personal life that you have found to be helpful in any way?
Yeah, we struggle with this a lot, as does everybody, I think. We try to make sure that we have blocks of time where we don't meet, where we actually do work, do our individual contributor work. So I love to write. I like to write content for the product and for our blog and various articles. And the engineers need time to code. Obviously, we all need time to execute. And so we work really hard to block time in the morning to execute and to make sure that, but even writing or coding, there's only so long you can do it. So we break up meeting time, right? So you can work for 2 hours and then that's the meeting time then becomes productive and works with the execution time. Email is a disaster, and all these interrupt-driven, all of it is a disaster. So I try to respond only at night when I'm already so tired I'm not good for much else. So I try to do email after 8:30 p.m.
So you don't check email till 8:30 in the evening?
I often don't. Sometimes I will. I'll put maybe a half an hour just quick scan through, and I put it in calendar, the email time, so that it's limited. And I'll put maybe half an hour. But in general, I wind up blowing through that email time and just checking it at 8:30 at night.
Wow. So what about work email, like from your team?
Well, we're all in the same room. I mean, they can talk to me. We're 6 person. It's the benefit of being 6 people and all in the same place.
Small but mighty.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Cool. I like that. That's a good tip. You know, I don't check till 4, which has been hard enough as it is. But I found that I am so much more productive when I don't get any social notifications to my phone. I don't get any email notifications to my phone.
Yeah.
And I'm so much more, I feel productive when I don't have all that stuff going on.
Yeah. I found when I was working at Google, I realized one day that I was probably spending 2 to 3 hours a day responding to email. And I just realized that's crazy. I was not getting paid to answer emails. And that was when at Google, I had half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the afternoon. And so I did email only in those 2 half an hour chunks and refused to ever do it again. And you do miss some stuff, but you gain more than you lose. And as long as you communicate clearly with the team what you're doing and why, so that they know you're not just blowing them off, right? You've got to remember to show that you care personally. I think you can make it work, spending a lot less time in email. Just very sort of ruthless about even the delete feature. Like that was too much time. That took too much time.
Yeah.
If it's unread, if I've looked at it, then it's done.
And I find that if it's really important, it'll kind of bubble up to the top of your inbox again. Like if it's if it's urgent, somebody will either call you, they'll text you, they'll email you again, somebody else will notify you about it. So if it's really super important, I find that it finds its way back into your inbox. Yes,
for the most part, that's true. Although I will confess that my daughter broke her arm at school. The school didn't. I mean, luckily they got through to my husband, but I realized I needed to make some exceptions. So that's
exceptions are good.
Yeah.
All right. So I want to jump now into a lot of the stuff in your book. Now you have some really cool stories about the time I think you presented to Tim Cook, you presented to executives at Google. So maybe we can start with a personal story that you've had of a great boss, and maybe a personal story you've had of a really bad boss. And if you don't want to, you don't have to give us any names or companies, but any kind of a story would be great.
Absolutely. So let's start with the great boss, because I think we don't have enough stories about great bosses. And great bosses can be such a source of growth and joy in your life when you have them. So one great boss I had was Sheryl Sandberg, and this was at Google. And she taught me so much about Radical Candor, what it is. And I'll just tell you quick story about a time when she criticized me. So it was about 2 or 3 months after I had joined Google, and I had to give a presentation to Google's founders and the CEO about the AdSense business, which I was leading online sales and operations for AdSense at the time. And so I walked into the room, and there is Sergey on a sort of elliptical trainer in the corner of the room. And Eric's so deep in his computer, Eric Schmidt, the CEO, was so deep in his email, it was like I'll never get his attention. And like any normal person in this situation, I felt a little bit nervous. But luckily, the business was on fire. And when I said how many new AdSense customers we had added over the previous couple of months, Eric's head jumped out of his computer, bounced out of his computer, to the extent it's possible to come to a screeching halt on an elliptical trainer. Sergey came to a screeching halt. And Eric said, what resources do you need? Do you need more marketing? Do you need more engineers? So I'm feeling like the meeting went reasonably well, right? In fact, I'm feeling like a genius. And as I was walking out of the room, Cheryl, my boss at the time, I'm expecting a high five or a pat on the back or something. And instead she says to me, why don't you walk back to my office with me? And I sort of felt utterly deflated. I thought, I'm sure I've screwed something up, and I'm about to hear what it is. And Cheryl started by saying the good stuff, and not in a feedback sandwich kind of way, but there were some things that had gone well that I wasn't aware of. So I learned something. But of course, all I wanted to hear about was what I had done wrong. And eventually, Cheryl says to me, this whole conversation, by the way, is 2 minutes. But Cheryl says to me, you said a lot in there. Were you aware of it? And I sort of breathed a huge sigh of relief. If that was all I had done wrong, it was no big deal. And I made a brush-off gesture with my hand. And I said, yeah, I know, it's a verbal tic. It's no big deal, really. And Cheryl said, I know a really good coach, and Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction? And again, I make this brush-off gesture with my hand. And I said, no, I'm busy. Didn't you hear about all these new customers? And Cheryl stopped. She looked me right in the eye, and she said, I can see when you make that gesture with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid. Now, she has my full attention. And some people would say it was mean of Cheryl to say it that way, but in fact, it was the kindest thing she could have done. And if she had been talking to somebody sort of less bullheaded than I am, she wouldn't have had to say it. She wouldn't have said it that strongly. But she knew that those were the words she had to use to get through to me. And so when she said it that way, I did go see the speech coach. And I learned she wasn't exaggerating one little bit. I really did say every third word. And this was really striking to me because I had been giving presentations for my entire career. I had raised $35 million for a startup giving presentations. I thought I was pretty good at it. Why had nobody told me? And what was it about Cheryl that made it so easy for her? And I thought about this, and I realized Cheryl did two things that helped her sort of say what nobody else had been willing to say to me. First was she cared personally about me. And I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that she had my back. When I moved from New York to California to take the job at Google and didn't have any friends out here, she invited me to join her book group. When I had an illness in the family and needed to fly off to help this family member, she said, don't worry, we have your back. Go. Don't take it as vacation time. Just take all the time you need. We've got you covered. And she didn't do that just for me. Cheryl did that for everyone who worked directly for her. So she cared personally, and that was in evidence all the time. But at the same time, she was totally willing to challenge us directly. She wasn't so concerned about not hurting my feelings that she would avoid telling me something that I really needed to hear. And so I spent 10 weeks working at McKinsey and went to business school. So I believe that all of life's problems can be boiled down to a good 2x2 matrix, right? So
naturally.
Yeah, naturally. So if you think about the first dimension of radical candor, it's care personally. And the second dimension, sort of the horizontal axis, if you will, is challenge directly. And when you can do both at the same time, it's radical candor. But when you fail to show that you care personally, but you do challenge directly, that's obnoxious aggression. And I think it's the fear of obnoxious aggression that prevents most of us from giving good feedback. The fear that other people will think we're a jerk or whatever. And the fear of not being liked prevents a lot of us from doing our job as leaders. But it didn't prevent Cheryl. Now, if you think back to the Bob story I told you a few minutes ago, I showed Bob that I cared personally, but I failed to challenge him directly. And that is the most common mistake I've seen throughout my career. And I call that mistake ruinous empathy. And then, of course, sometimes we all fail on both dimensions. We fail usually because we're so busy, absorbed in our own stuff, but we fail to show we care personally. We also fail to challenge directly. And instead we just flatter people. And that mistake I call manipulative insincerity. So the way to think about this framework, and the lesson that I learned from Cheryl, is to make sure that you do care personally and also challenge directly, but also forgive yourself. If you are sometimes obnoxious, don't move the wrong way and back off your challenge, because you'll wind up in a worse place, manipulative insincerity. Just do take a moment to show you care. And when you think you're being nice by withholding criticism, remember, that's ruinous empathy, and it's not so nice after all, especially if it means you're going to wind up having to fire somebody.
Yeah, no, that's very true. All right, so that's an example of a good boss, and I love that story. You talk about it in the book as well, and it's, I think, a really great way to kind of explain what that radical candor means. Do you have a story of a bad boss?
Yes, I do. Like all of us, I've had some terrible bosses. There was once a boss, and I'm a big believer in praise in public, criticize in private, so I'm not gonna name names. But I had a boss who would do things like, say, he said to me once, "Don't worry your pretty little head about that." So very belittling. He once walked into a friend of mine's office, hit the speakerphone button, and said, "Call Mary, but don't tell Mary I'm in the room, and ask Mary what she thinks of me." Like, who does that? It's sort of this middle school move, but one of the most highly paid executives in Silicon Valley. Another time, there was a big party. He threw a big party for his team, and he told everybody to come in their national costume. And I guess he was new to the company, didn't really understand that it was a whimsical culture. And so everybody came to this party dressed up in ridiculous ways. And he, of course, came in a Armani tux. I'm not sure he wasn't British. I'm not sure what he thought his national costume was. But anyway, that's what he came dressed in. And he felt ridiculously overdressed. But instead of laughing at himself, he walked up to this friend of mine and he said to him, "I said, come dressed in your national costume, not dressed like a fool." So again, just belittling, unnecessarily belittling, and obnoxious. It was a case of obnoxious aggression. Now, the real problem, the really interesting, I hated this guy and was so miserable that I literally shrunk half an inch. And I'm only 5 feet tall. I don't have half an inch to give. Yeah. I literally shrunk half an inch while working for this guy. And I bumped into him later, and I had a really important realization. And the realization was that the problem was not that guy's behavior. The problem was that I failed to stand up to him. The problem was that I met obnoxious aggression with manipulative insincerity. And I hated myself for it. It was really myself I was mad at, not him. So I think it's really important when you do have a boss who's doing stuff that's driving you crazy, to find a way to give it a voice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And I think we've all worked for and we've all seen those types of managers. The show Silicon Valley is out. Yeah. We definitely see that exhibited in Silicon Valley quite a bit. So, okay, awesome examples of a great boss and a bad boss. Now, you have this grid matrix that you talked about, and you touched on some of them already, but can you give us an example of the 4 different types of possibilities that are in there so that listeners can tell if either maybe they are that type of a boss or if they work for that type of a boss?
Right. I think it's a great question, but I'm going to reframe it a little bit, because the way that I want your listeners to use the Radical Candor framework is not to judge themselves or to judge other people, because the fact of the matter is we all make mistakes that I'm going to talk about all the time. So use this framework not to judge yourself or to judge your boss, but to guide your conversations in the right direction. So
fair enough.
When you do care personally and challenge directly at the same time, that's radical candor, and that's what you're shooting for. Now, there will be times when you behave like a jerk. I can promise you that. I wish I could give you a formula never to be a jerk. I can't. We all are there sometimes. So here's a story. I will assert for the record that I'm not a jerk, but I will tell you a story about a time when I behaved like a jerk. It was, again, shortly after I joined Google, and I got into an argument with Larry Page, one of the co-founders, about an AdSense policy. And I sent an email out to about 30 people, including Larry, that said, Larry claims he wants to organize all the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. But if it'll make us a buck, he's willing to create clutter sites that muddle the world's information. So this was obnoxious aggression.
You sent this out to everybody, including Larry?
Yeah. Not my most politically astute move. So
interesting.
It's worth explaining why I did such a stupid thing. In part, it was because Google had a culture of challenging authority, but it did not have a culture of obnoxious aggression. So why did I do that? I think the reason I made that particular mistake was that I believe, as I'm sure you do, and probably all of your listeners do, that there's a special place in hell for people who kiss up and kick down. But
yes.
It doesn't mean that doing the exact opposite is so smart either. There's no reason to kick up. And that was sort of what I was doing. I was kicking Larry in the shins for no good reason. I should have been talking about the AdSense policy and working hard to understand it. And instead, I was just insulting the guy personally. And I was wrong. I was wrong about my understanding of the situation. And I was also, like, Larry is neither hypocritical. He's a wonderful human being. So I was dead wrong. But it's interesting, in my coaching, I found that an awful lot of people do make that mistake. They because they believe it's so wrong to kiss up and kick down, they sort of punch their boss in the face unnecessarily, or their boss's boss, or in my case, it was my boss's boss's boss. So don't make that mistake. Now, the other mistake
Did you get fired, by the way, or reprimanded in any way? Or was it just...
No. This is what was so interesting about the situation. I found out later, Larry actually thought the email was pretty funny. He liked the email.
That's good.
Yeah. I mean, Larry really worked hard to develop a culture in which people would challenge him. So that was fine. The email itself was fine. The problem the real mistake I made was what I did next. It's never the crime. It's always the cover-up, right? That's the problem. And so what I did next, a friend of mine picked up the phone actually and called me and said, why did you send that email? That was obnoxious and that was stupid. And I realized it was obnoxious and stupid. And so the next time I saw Larry, instead of moving up on the care personally dimension of radical candor, I backed off my challenge. And I said to him, Larry, I'm really sorry. That was such an obnoxious email. I realize you're right. I was wrong. Only two problems with saying that. The first problem, and the biggest one, was that I was lying. I didn't actually think that. And the second problem was that he knew I was lying, and he kind of looked at me like I was a pigeon that had pooped on his shoulder and walked off. It was one of those bad moments, and the guy sitting next to me patted me on the shoulder, and he said he actually likes it better when you disagree with him. And so the lesson that I would encourage people to learn is when you do find yourself having been obnoxious, don't back off your challenge. Instead, move up on the care personally axis and the care personally dimension of radical candor and realize that the person you were just obnoxious to is a human being and you can apologize for being obnoxious. But if you still disagree with whatever it was that you were raising, point it out, but just point it out in a more radically candid way. So move towards radical candor, not towards manipulative insincerity, because we all issue these false apologies, and they don't work. People see through them.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I've certainly been guilty of doing that myself.
Yeah, we all have, because we feel so bad about being obnoxiously aggressive. I think when you are when you're in the ruinous empathy quadrant, when you're making the mistake that I made with Bob, when you have somebody who you're working with who's making a mistake and you don't want to hurt their feelings, so you don't point it out to them and then they keep making the mistake. I think the best thing you can do is realize that telling the person about it is actually an act of great kindness. Pretend like it's not about some super important project, or pretend it's about a spinach in the teeth. You know that it's not kind to tell somebody when they have not to tell somebody when they have spinach in their teeth. They can get the spinach out of their teeth. So just boil it down to something simpler and realize that withholding your feedback is not an act of kindness. It's actually profoundly unkind. And challenge the person, tell the person what you see. Or praise. I mean, this works with praise and criticism. Sometimes people are reluctant to give praise because they're worried that it'll come off as patronizing or insincere. If you see something that's awesome, say it. Like, give voice to what impresses you.
I agree. All right, so did we cover all four, or did we miss one there? We talked about radical candor.
Candor. We talked about obnoxious aggression. That was the story with my email to Larry.
Yes.
Then we talked about manipulative insincerity. That was the false apology. And then we talked about ruinous empathy, the fourth one. And that's the mistake I made with Bob, when you're withholding feedback from somebody because you don't want to hurt their feelings. And that is the most, from what I've seen in every different kind of work environment, 85% of mistakes that get made at work happen in the ruinous empathy quadrant.
You want to be seen as a nice person.
Yeah, you want to genuinely care about the other person. Now, when you want to be, there's a nuance here, an important and interesting nuance. When you want to be seen as a nice person, you might be dipping into manipulative insincerity, right? Yeah. But when you're genuinely just worried about the other person's feelings and don't want to hurt them, then you're usually being ruinously empathetic.
How do you actually show that you care? I know there's a lot of debate on this. I mean, is this something that you can teach? It almost seems like you need to genuinely be a people person to care about others. But if you genuinely don't care about others and you're just kind of in it for yourself, and you happen to get promoted to a managerial or a leadership position, can you kind of convert somebody in that role to all of a sudden teach them to become empathetic, to teach them to genuinely care? Or is that person just he shouldn't or she shouldn't be a manager or a leader?
I think that you can teach people to show that they care. If somebody genuinely doesn't care about others, then then you've got a different problem. But I honestly, I can't think of anybody I've ever met who really doesn't care about other people. It doesn't mean you have to be super social. In fact, often, interestingly, the super social people tend to make the manipulative insincerity mistake. So I think that it doesn't mean, it's not an extroversion, introversion thing. I think the vast majority of people really do care, but it is hard to show that you care. My co-founder, Russ Laraway, developed a really great methodology when he was at Google, and then he rolled it out at Twitter as well, to teach people how to have career conversations. And the first of the career conversations that he taught people to have was a get-to-know-you conversation. Now, at first, it seems ridiculous to think you have to teach people how to have a get-to-know-you conversation. But at work, I think all too often, we are reluctant to talk about anything that is personal. And if you're so reluctant to talk about anything that is personal, it's very hard to care personally. And so Russ developed a training that taught people how to have these get-to-know-you conversations in a way that wasn't going to get them into HR trouble, just wasn't going to get them into some sort of overly creepy, overly personal situation. How to make sure, just reminded people of things they already knew, common sense things. Like if somebody seems uncomfortable starting a conversation with starting about kindergarten, tell me your life, say, why don't we start with high school or grad school or, 10 years ago, whatever. It doesn't have, this is not a therapy session, but I want to get to know a little bit about you and your life. And the vast majority of people do this, love doing this. And one of the pieces of advice that Russ gave to managers is if you hate the get to know you conversation, you might reconsider your role as a manager.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, you need to have that kind of that people aspect of wanting to talk to others and genuinely care about the success and the personal well-being of the people that you're supposed to be managing.
Yes.
Why do you think that there are so many bad bosses today? Or maybe the perception of bad bosses. We keep hearing about these horror stories, terrible engagement scores, people hate their jobs, they don't like their bosses. Are we just promoting the wrong types of people, or are we just not training them properly? Why do we have this big problem?
I think most often when somebody becomes a manager for the first time, they get no instruction as to what the job is, what it means, and they often get bad signals. I think one of the themes of Radical Candor is that telling people what to do doesn't work. But an awful lot of people think their job as boss is to tell people what to do. And so one of the goals in writing the book and also in starting the company and doing the podcast is to begin giving managers, brand new managers, as well as more experienced people, the sort of step-by-step instructions of what's the philosophy and what are the things you can do to put a good management philosophy into place. It's really fascinating how few companies really invest in teaching managers how to be great managers. And even those who are really good at it tend to focus on the most senior leaders, not the brand new managers. And there's a lot more brand new managers who have this sort of the experience that I had with Bob. You get thrown into the deep end of the pool and you don't get taught what to do and how to do it. And so that's one of the things we're trying to fix at Candor Inc. is to teach people how to be a good boss.
It seems like you typically get taught the the budgeting, the planning, the P&L, like that kind of stuff, and you don't get taught the soft skill component nearly as much as you should be.
Yeah, and calling it a soft skill is also part of the problem. It is difficult. It's both. It both is very difficult, so it's hard in that respect, but it also has a huge impact on OKR achievement, on results, if you get this right. So it's a very bottom line oriented sort of skill. If you can tell people when they're going in the right direction, wrong direction, you're much more likely to hit your objectives and achieve your goals. If you can think very clearly about who on your team should be put in what roles, you're much more likely to have a cohesive team where the sum of the whole, where you get much more out of 5 people working together than 5 people working separately.
What role does the external, and well, it's maybe not even the external environment, but what role does the broader corporate environment play? Because you're a manager, but obviously you have a manager. There's the corporate culture. There's kind of like these big macro factors inside the company, the teams, the profits. All these different types of things that are going on. What role does that kind of broader perspective that you can't really control? How does that impact the whole good boss, bad boss situation?
No matter how terrible your boss is, you can be a good boss. You do not have to imitate bad behavior. And it's one of the liberating things about Radical Candor is you can be the kind of boss that you wish you had for your people, and you can create a little micro culture, even within a broader culture that's not as good. Now, I would also say, however, that if you cannot get to the point that you can be radically candid with your own boss, that you can ask for feedback and get some, that you can find some things about what your boss is doing that you really like, that you want your boss to continue doing or to do more of. And that you can, if you cannot criticize your boss to your boss's face, you probably at some point should polish up your resume and start looking for a new boss. However, I would argue if you follow a pretty simple set of steps, if you start by soliciting feedback from, and this is true up, down, and sideways, but from your boss, if you start by soliciting feedback and work really hard to understand where your boss is coming from, what you could do or stop doing that would make your boss's life better. And then you focus on the good stuff a little bit. You focus on the things that are going well. And then you ask if you can give some criticism. If you see something that's bugging you that you want to tell your boss about, the vast majority of bosses will say, of people, will say yes. The vast majority of bad bosses are not bad people. They're just bad bosses. So if you can create the environment with your own team that you feel better about, and then you can work with your boss doing the same exact thing that you just did with your team, you can create a little microculture of radical candor in a lot of environments.
What if you're the boss? Do you then just go up to all your employees and say, "Hey, Kim, tell me what you think of me," or what do you think about my management style?
How do you solicit radical candor?
Exactly.
It's difficult because people do not want to give you feedback. They hate giving feedback. So there are 4 steps. The first step I would suggest is to come up with a go-to question, because they don't want to tell you, and that their reluctance to tell you can often make it hard for you to ask for the feedback. So right now, every listener listening to this podcast, you should do this. Think of a question that you can imagine actually asking somebody. So, for example, a question that I used to like to ask is there anything that I could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? However, a good friend of mine, Krista Quarles, who's the CEO of OpenTable, said, I could never ask that question. It sounds ridiculous coming out of my mouth. The thing that I like to ask people is, tell me why I'm smoking crack here, right? So it doesn't matter. You have to come up with the words that you can imagine actually uttering, right? And if it sounds corny to you, then come up with a way to ask a question that doesn't sound corny. But you've got to figure out how to ask the question. So step number 1, come up with a go-to question. Step number 2, and this is sort of paradoxical, you have to embrace the discomfort. For a long time in my career, I thought the best way to get the truth out of people was to make them really comfortable. And it was Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel, who explained to me one time on a walk that I had this exactly wrong. He said, you've got to embrace the discomfort. The only way you're going to get feedback out of people is if you make it more uncomfortable for them to say something than for them to say nothing. Because what they want to do is say nothing. And so some simple advice, again, really simple advice you can take today is after you ask your go-to question, shut your mouth and count to 6. See, I only just made it to 3, and that felt like a really long time. Almost nobody can endure that much silence.
I know, I was just about to ask you, are you still there?
Yeah. I should have waited to 4.
I know, I would have started to panic.
I would have proved my point. So you've got to be silent, and people will then usually say something to you. They'll tell you something. Now, that brings us to step number 3. Step number 3 is to listen with the intent to understand, not to respond. You cannot get defensive. If you do, it's the last feedback you'll ever get from somebody. But it's the most natural thing in the world to feel defensive, especially when you get criticized by somebody. So you've got to find a way to listen with the intent to understand, not to respond. And then step number 4 is to reward the candor. So you want to make sure that you give somebody a reward for having told you what they told you.
Their favorite candy, right?
Not the candy their parents use when potty training them either. Although that's not a bad idea. But the right reward is if you agree with the feedback, fix the problem. So in the case of Cheryl telling me that I said too often, the right reward was to go to the speech coach and fix the problem, and then tell her that I had done it and thank her for helping me. And the harder reward comes though when you disagree with the feedback, and you will disagree with some feedback you get and should. So the thing to do when you disagree with the feedback, the reward to give, is first of all to focus on the 5% of whatever has just been said to you that you can agree with. And so focus on that, and then say to them, I want to talk to you in a couple of days. I want to follow up. And a couple of days later, when you're sure you're not defensive, explain your point of view again and explain exactly why you disagree, and be open to being persuaded that you're wrong and the other person is right. But in other words, sometimes the only reward you have to offer is a fuller explanation of why you disagree. But it's got to be done respectfully and in a way that shows that you heard the feedback.
Not getting defensive, I think, is huge because...
Huge.
Yeah, I mean, even in personal life, right? If a friend or a spouse tells you something, it's very hard to not get like, what do you mean? I don't know. All of a sudden you get into like whole defensive mode.
Jacob, I lost you for some reason.
Oh, can you hear me? Hello?
You were breaking up. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay.
You're just breaking up.
Oh,
You're breaking up for a minute.
So I was saying, in our personal lives, it's also very hard to not get defensive about stuff like that at all.
Yes. So often you're going to get feedback that will feel personal or where the person is not giving you good examples. I think the really important thing when you get feedback that is bad is not to criticize the criticism. You want to make sure that you are open to whatever it is that is being said to you. However, when you give feedback, it's really important to avoid talking about somebody's personality, because when you're giving feedback, you're helping the person make a change. Does that make sense to you, Jacob?
No, that makes complete sense.
So you do want to make sure that you're giving feedback that is about a specific, you can describe the situation, you can describe the behavior or the work, and then the impact that the behavior or the work had. And that'll help you make sure that you're not sort of criticizing somebody's personality. I mean, the problem is never that somebody has a personality flaw. It's always more specific than that. But it's very tempting to attribute mistakes to some sort of personality flaw.
Yeah, so stick to the issue instead of focusing on the person necessarily. And I think it's absolutely good advice. You had one section...
Let me jump in. There's one other really important nuance here, though. I think it's really important when you are giving feedback, if somebody reacts emotionally, eliminate the words, don't take it personally, from your vocabulary. Because we spend more time at work than we do anywhere else in our lives. And when we screw up, it does feel personal. So it doesn't, just because somebody's having an emotional response doesn't mean that they're having a bad response. It means that they're having a human response. And your job in that moment is to react with compassion, not to tell them how to react. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, I think that's absolutely good advice. You had one section in the book that I wanted to make sure I touch on because I thought it was interesting. And it was actually called the problem with passion.
Yes.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
So you talked earlier about Silicon Valley, and I think when you, as a leader, try to provide purpose to your team and tell them why their work has meaning, you're really at risk of sounding like the Hooli CEO and just way overstepping, pretending like this is about saving the world when it's not. It's about answering emails more efficiently or whatever. And so I think the other thing that's important, the other sort of problem with passion is that different people find meaning in work in different ways. So there's a really good story about Christopher Wren, who was the architect who rebuilt the cathedral in London after the Great Fire of London. And the story goes that he was walking around the construction zone, and he saw a worker, and he said, "What are you doing?" And one worker said, "I'm laying bricks." And then he saw another worker, and he said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm making a wall." And then he saw a third worker, and he said, "What are you doing?" And the worker replied, "I'm building a cathedral to the Almighty." And I think really often, especially here in Silicon Valley, we tend to think it is the leader's job to persuade everybody they're building a cathedral to the Almighty. But for the guy who was laying bricks, like maybe he was an atheist, maybe building a cathedral to the Almighty would not have given his work meaning. People find meaning in their work in different ways. And your job as the manager is to get to know each individual well enough to understand what gives meaning to their work, how they find purpose, what motivates them, and to help them find roles and grow in the way that they want to grow, find meaning in the way that they find it. It's not to provide purpose, because you're just going to wind up looking like an arrogant jerk if you try to provide purpose.
So if money is the motivating factor, that's okay.
There is nothing wrong with having a job that pays the rent, that allows you to raise a family in the way you want to raise a family. There's nothing wrong with that at all, in my book anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting that now it's kind of like, oh, well, you can't just work for a paycheck. You have to have this like connection.
That's BS. I mean,
Yeah.
of course you can.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people in the world that they're happy to be able to provide for their family, and that is all they care about, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, I started out in business. I mean, as it turned out, the work itself did have meaning, but I went to business school because I wanted to fund my novel writing habit, not because I cared about business.
Yeah.
So people have, there's a lot of work that people love. People are painters, they're artists, they love to garden, they want to raise families. There's a lot of work that doesn't pay that people do that, and their jobs have meaning because they support that other thing. There's nothing wrong with that.
In other words, meaning doesn't have to always come from your job. It can come from outside places as well, and that's okay.
Yeah, I'll never forget. I was coaching this young woman, and she was trying really hard to convince herself that she had a great passion for event planning. And some people do, but this young woman did not. And I said, it's okay. Like, you're good at it, and it doesn't have to be your passion for you to be successful doing it.
Fair enough. I think that's a very important point for a lot of people to remember, because we're kind of this whole concept of purpose is pushed very heavily on us in our organizations and pretty much everywhere you go.
Yeah, early in my career, I was talking to a mentor who said to me, only about 5% of human beings have a real vocation where they have work that they were put on this earth to do. And they confuse the hell out of the rest of us. And it was such a relief. I was like, oh, thank God. I don't have to know what I want to be when I grow up. I'm just going to muddle along and enjoy my life. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing wrong with that at all. So I had some people ask or tell me about some questions they wanted me to ask you, because I put this up online that I was speaking with you. And one person named Jeffrey Phillips left a comment, and he said, besides the obvious soft skills, compassion, dedication, hard work, etc. What do you truly seek in a good employee? What makes someone fit into a job where it doesn't for others? And maybe it doesn't have to be what you specifically seek in a good employee, but what a manager or what a boss should look for in a good employee besides, he says, the obvious soft skills.
Well, I mean, if you're hiring somebody to be a software engineer, they need to really enjoy coding. I think one of the most important things is to look for people who want to do that role, not just be that role. So if you're hiring a manager, you need to hire people who want to do the things that managers do, not be a manager. If you're hiring a doctor, you want to hire somebody who likes to do the things that doctors do, not be a doctor. I think it's really important that, again, like, you got to get away from passion, but like, I love writing. I don't really necessarily want to be a writer, but I love spending time writing. I love working with a team. I love watching people grow and take a step in the direction of their dreams. I love that. It brings me enormous pleasure. So you need to make sure that whatever it is that you're hiring for, people want to do that job.
That's great advice, because I found in my book that it's not so much that the organization controls the work that you do, the organization controls the environment in which the work gets done. You as the employee kind of control the work because you decide on what you're going to study in school, you pick your career path, you pick the company you're going to apply for, the role you're going to apply for. And every company has these static roles, right? Every company needs sales. Every company needs marketing. Every company needs engineering and development. So it's not as if the company can just control and make those things go away. So,
right.
But the company can control the three environments I always talk about are culture, technology, physical space. Mm-hmm. So the company can control how you feel, the tools that you use, the spaces in which you work, but it can't just control the work and change everything that you're doing. So the employee needs a little bit more accountability, kind of the way you said, to make sure that they want to do the things that doctors do, that they want to do the things that engineers do. So it's not just about the company trying to create Pinocchio's Island, but you as an employee need that accountability to make sure that this is what you want to do.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's also, I mean, I go back to your story about getting your first job out of college. I think there's also, there was a person on the team who had studied philosophy, and this was when I was at Google. And her job now was to answer customer support tickets. So it was really far less interesting than philosophy. And I was talking to her about this struggle, which is you get out of college and you've been reading super interesting books, or you've been doing really intellectually heady work for the most part. And then you get your first job, and there's a lot of grunt work. And she said to me, Spinoza had to grind lenses and Plutarch lay bricks. And so I think it's really important to find, especially if there's a lot of grunt work involved in a job, to be clear about that grunt work and to make sure that people aren't going to feel offended that they have to do it, that they know what they're going to, not just what they're going to be. I mean, because it was sort of, cool to say you worked at Google, but that the people were willing to do the work that needed to get done.
Yep, you got to set those expectations. And another question I had is from Dale Halverson, who says, how can Radical Candor contribute to a superior employee experience? So
the thing that is most important about Radical Candor is that we want a witness to our lives. And there's nothing worse than feeling invisible. And so Radical Candor will give you a witness to your life, and it will help you grow in the way that you want to grow. So what I mean by that is when you're doing great work, you want it to be recognized. And when you're screwing up, you want to know that somebody will tell you and help you fix it. those are the things that are going to help you take a step in the direction of your dreams. And that's why Radical Candor helps create a better employee experience, is because what people want is to grow and to feel heard. The times when I remember there was when I was working at, we'll call it a large tech company, and said large tech company had acquired a great company, a great startup. And after about a year, the founder of that great startup decided to leave the company that had acquired his startup. And he left with tears in his eyes. And he said, I just can't get heard here. And that's so frustrating when you feel invisible or unheard, when you feel that your work has no impact or that nobody cares. It's a terrible feeling. That's what is more destructive than anything else, I think, to employee engagement.
Absolutely. Well, I know we're just about out of time, but before I ask you where people can connect with you, I'm curious how we can apply this in our personal lives, like outside of work, because just the way that we interact with friends, with spouses, with family members, it seems like there's a lot of this concept of radical candor that we can apply in our personal lives. But I'm curious, is it the same thing? You know, like if I don't know, if I go downstairs and tell my wife something and I'm, radically candid with her, I'm wondering how she would take that.
Yes.
How receptive she would be. So can we apply the exact same concepts in our personal life, or is it kind of a little bit of a different situation there? Radical candor is really about relationships, and different kinds of relationships are different. Romance is different than friendship, and being a boss is different. I would say in many ways, with my spouse anyway, and with my kids, it's way easier to be radically candid because it's easier to show you care. I can go up to my husband and give him a great big old kiss, and I can't do that with my employees. And then you tell him the mistake that he's making, right?
Well, yeah, or the thing that I disagree with. But the other day we were having a disagreement, and we both looked at each other and we said, we are on the same side here, and we're in this together. And that's the essence of any kind of partnership, really, is we're in this together. We're struggling with this, and we have different points of view, but we both want the same. We both want the same outcome here. So I think that it is in any relationship you have, you want to show that you care personally. And at work, sometimes that just means give a damn. When you're really lucky, it means love. But with your family and your friends, it always means love. So you're always higher up on the care personally dimension, I think, in your personal life than you are at work. But you also need to challenge people directly. I mean, when you care about somebody and you see them making a mistake, it is vital. We depend on each other. To tell each other when we're making a mistake, because it's so hard to see it yourself when you're making a mistake. So it's true. I think it's funny. I gave the Radical Candor talk recently, and somebody came running up to me afterwards and said, if only I had heard this talk 5 years ago, I wouldn't be getting a divorce right now.
Oh, wow.
And so that was a long-winded way of answering your question. Yes, I think this can apply to all of your relationships.
Well, I'm going to practice it at home, and we'll see how it goes. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on that I didn't ask you as it relates to your book?
No, I think you did a great job covering the key things in the book. I hope that people who hear all your listeners will buy the book, and your book too. It's a lot of work to write a book, and hopefully a lot of value. I hope that people, if you want additional sort of weekly reminders, will listen to the Radical Candor podcast. And if you have questions, go to radicalcandor.com. You can try our software. It's free for now. It's in alpha. And you can just send us questions. Russ, my co-founder, and I answer the emails when you send us questions.
Well, I was just about to ask you where people can go to learn more about you. So the book available wherever books are sold. I see it in airports all the time.
Awesome.
Your podcast, how can they find that? Is that on iTunes if they search for that?
iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you look for your podcast, just search for Radical Candor. And the website is radicalcandor.com.
Perfect. Well, Kim, I know that, and people, we didn't talk about this, so nobody knows, but you are at your doctor's office sneaking away time to speak with me. So I appreciate you going into an empty room at your doctor's office to speak with me today.
Great chatting with you, and many thanks to Nancy Mason, who goes above and beyond as a doctor to give me office space as well as.
Very cool. Yeah, you're going to have to start giving her a monthly co-working fee there.
That's right.
Well, Kim, thanks again, and thanks everyone for tuning into this week's episode of the podcast. My guest has been the New York Times bestselling author of Radical Candor, Be a Kickass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity, co-host of the Radical Candor podcast, and co-founder of Candor Inc., and I definitely recommend you guys check out her book. I had the opportunity to read it, and it was awesome. I'll see all of you guys next week. Thanks again for tuning into today's episode. Please remember to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred channel is. I cannot express how important those reviews and ratings are to the success of this show, and they keep allowing me to bring back amazing guests. Lastly, don't forget to check out the brand new PDF that I just put out, which looks at the evolution of the employee. In other words, how employees are evolving and changing, and what you as an organization should do to adapt. You'll get a complete breakdown of what that evolution looks like, as well as action items that you can and should be taking. That PDF is available at thefutureemployee.com. And if you want to reach out to me for whatever reason, whether it's inviting me to speak, sponsoring the show, or just giving me some feedback, you can always do so. My email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Again, that's jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.